I wanted to begin by thanking Catherine Ettman, who introduced me from Princeton. She was hoping to be with us today, but she actually has just won the Spirit of Princeton Award, which is one of the biggest awards a student can win. We both decided she should stay there and go to the banquet for it tonight. But she wanted to be with us because she's very interested in these topics. And it reminds me, not only am I very proudly a professor at Princeton, but also, particularly on a day like today, very proudly also a part of Harvard. As I think about the innovation and the excitement and the vigor and the creativity in this room and across the campus and the generosity that the Hausers have shown that has made all of these innovations possible at a level we could never have imagined. I am indeed proud to be part of Harvard. But innovation is not a word we might necessarily have associated with Harvard always in the past. I remember a session in New York City for alumni where Youngmi Moon, your colleague at the business school, who's a very strong leader in her own right, was giving a talk about Harvard today. And she asked along the course of her talk, so how many of these words would you associate innovation with? She asked the audience. Google, almost everybody raised their hand. Picasso, after a brief break, almost everybody raised their hand. Harvard. Very few people raised their hands. And she was basically saying what we need to do in this generation of Harvard faculty, students, and staff is to make clear how much we are innovating and to make it work in even stronger ways. And that's what we're gathered to do today. So my assignment is preservation. And I want to talk about the things that we should be sure to try to preserve amidst all the exciting changes we have been discussing. But most of the changes we've actually talked about today are very positive in themselves, and it's hard to see how they're going to threaten most of our values. But the sorts of things that Julio has just mentioned, the excitement of online education, brings a new set of challenges about how we preserve some of the things that we have always cared about. So that's what I want to focus on for just a few minutes, but then I want to broaden it at the end to a larger neighborly question that I hope you will talk about with each other. So what should we be sure to preserve amidst all these changes, and particularly online education? And I want to distinguish between 4 things that I think it would be very desirable to preserve and 5 things that I think are essential to preserve. And I'll be brief. The things that I think are very desirable to preserve include institutional loyalties among faculty and students, alumni, staff, to a particular institution like Harvard. I was thinking about a plaque that appears outside the main gate from the Science Center to the yard. You may have seen it. It's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Journals of 1836. He has just been to the 200th anniversary, the jubilee of his university, and he talks about his very palpable sense of all the spirits who were there with them, people who were walking with them in the procession, this long, winding train going back and forward into eternity. Now that's institutional loyalty, and you don't get that without feeling a connection between the Harvard we are part of today and the Harvard of the past and the future. The second thing that I think it's worth preserving, at least desirable to preserve, is for traditional undergraduates, the sense of a rite of passage to adulthood. Now, I know that many of our students today are not traditional aged undergraduates, but for those who are, someday your son, my own children and now grandchildren, I think it's very valuable to have this sense that you leave home, you join another community, you form networks with your peers, and you have experiences you've never quite had before and will never quite have again. And it is, for our particular culture, the passage to adulthood. And there are many ways in which this works. I think it would be too bad if we lost this altogether and we had too many students who were getting their degrees online in their pajamas upstairs in their bedrooms. For many reasons, I think this would be a bad idea. The third thing that I think it would be desirable to protect, which is related, in fact, to the second, is a sense of shared extracurricular activities. Online learning allows you to master something if you are disciplined enough to stick to it. But it doesn't give you the sense that you're also sharing with the same people, sports and arts and opportunities for parties, explorations together, bull sessions late into the night, community service, all the ways in which we grow through undergraduate education especially, but also graduate and professional education on campus. And the last thing I think it's very desirable for us to preserve, and here I don't even need an audiovisual aid. I just ask you to use your imaginations of what you see when you walk outside these doors. Beautiful campuses, physical spaces, which have within them not only these memories of institutional loyalties, but treasures that we are preserving, stewarding across the years of architecture in our libraries, in our museums, that campuses themselves, the most spacious of the bricks in the bricks and clicks, are very much worth preserving. But as I said, all of those things, however important they may be, and I believe they are the things I would regard as desirable to preserve. So what have I left for essential? I think there are 5 things that however our education evolves, whatever innovations and adaptations we engage in, there are 5 things we should try to be sure to preserve in order to be faithful to the way higher education has evolved across the centuries in every country and the ways in which we want to move it forward to serve the future. The first is accessibility for people from all kinds of backgrounds to have an opportunity to have the best education for which they are ambitious, talented, curious, and prepared. That has huge financial consequences, and I realize it's an idealistic statement. But unless we do that, we will start to see a world in which the online education is primarily for people of lesser means and is given in universities which do not have the kinds of resources a Harvard has. And those fortunate few, that 5% of the applicants or whatever, who can come to a place like Harvard or Princeton, will have an exceptional education, very different from that offered to many of their peers. And alas, a place like Harvard or Princeton may wind up looking much more like the WASP male enclave of the 19th century, which we've wisely got beyond, but we could fall back into it if we're not careful. So accessibility. The second thing we should be sure to preserve is the canon of human achievements, the great classics in every field, literature and art and theater and music, but also scientific and mathematical achievements, aspects of the human accomplishment portfolio that have inspired people for many generations. Universities have been the major stewards of those classics, and we preserve them not just by putting them away in cold storage, but by using them, by teaching them, by rethinking them, by reinterpreting them year after year after year. And that, I believe, is one of our most important functions. However we do that, I think we need to be sure to keep the classics in every field alive and hand them on. The third one that's related to that, but I want to distinguish it, is to preserve the works of the human spirit that are not classics. And I think about the research that historians or anthropologists do. When they go back and they look at letters, of which there are all too few these days, letters, deeds, property statements in little bitty towns, the ways in which they reconstruct the past through artifacts that are certainly not classics, but provide a sort of tangible basis for understanding how human beings lived in the past. And the reason I'm worried about that particular store of wisdom, knowledge, or just folly, but at least it's a store of human action, is because as our technologies for developing and sharing and storing knowledge change, we are in some danger of losing many of these artifacts because nobody's thinking as hard as they should about how you preserve crumbling pieces of paper in a little courthouse in a small Midwestern town. And maybe they're now on floppy disks, and who can read a floppy disk today? So we have to be careful to think about preserving knowledge in the broadest sense, as well as the classics. The fourth thing that I think it's crucial to preserve, and one of the things I worry about in a world that would become too focused on online learning alone, is the marvelous symbiosis between teaching and research for both faculty and students. Catherine mentioned that I advised her thesis this year. It was a great learning experience for both of us. Princeton, as you may know, requires the senior thesis. And I've advised some students for which this was, to use Julio's terms, a transformative experience, quite a few. And I've advised some for whom it was a good idea. They worked through it, they learned some things, they got that thing bound, and they felt good about it. And some for whom it was a real slog. But on balance, it was a very important experience for each Princeton senior and for their advisors. And for, of course, those of us who do research as a large commitment of our time and energy, I think almost every one of us would say that we learn a lot about what we should be researching, how we should be approaching it, how some of the most important questions might get framed by teaching. And teaching graduate students, of course, but also teaching undergraduates who ask the most flippant and fresh and unusual questions and cause you to think again about something you may always have taken for granted. So somehow sustaining, don't having the research all done in a think tank somewhere and the teaching all done online would be a very bad idea. We need to keep teaching and research together. But the last one of my essential ones, and the one where I want to pause for a few minutes of conversation with you all, each with each other, is about preserving the community of teachers and learners, the scholars having a chance to come together, to talk about what they've learned, to learn from each other. Some of this can be virtual. I understand virtual communities can indeed sometimes be rich and rewarding, but I would also argue that some of it needs to be face-to-face. You learn things from being physically with people that you don't learn virtually, just as the reverse is true. So I believe finding ways in which we preserve communities of scholars in all these new forms of learning is one of our most important and most pressing obligations. I was thinking about some of the things we heard in this marvelous set of presentations this morning, and I was struck, as I'm sure you were if you were here, by the really absorbing and memorable description that Jennifer Roberts gave of that painting of the little boy with the squirrel. I, at least, was transfixed. I think many of you were. But one of the things I reflected on afterward was it was valuable for all of us to be seeing and sharing that together, even if we didn't talk about it together. And it would have been great if we had had a chance, each of us, to spend maybe not 3 hours, but at least 10 minutes looking at it, and then share some of the things we've seen. And we would learn from each other about aspects of that picture that we had not seen ourselves, even as lay people, even not as experts. So even for something like looking at a wonderful painting, which you might think is the most solitary of acts. You don't want anybody babbling in your ear when you're enjoying that painting. But there is also something very rewarding about being able to talk to people about what you saw and to learn about what you didn't see. So the question that I would like to ask you all to think about, talk about with each other in neighborly conversations for the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'm going to reserve a minute at the end to come back and ask you a question about what you've said, is this: how do we preserve the community of teachers and scholars, teachers and learners, in both the new world of online education? Harvard is not relying on this as much as some of our peers, because we can still afford to have education of all kinds, tutorials, seminars, lectures, online, whatever people may choose. But we're not only talking about Harvard today, we're talking about higher education. And for many universities, this is something that is going to loom larger and larger as a big part of their toolkit. And for many students, this will be a larger and larger part of their certificates, of their gathering of course credits for graduation. And so how do we preserve some opportunity for a community of discussion, of learning from each other, intergenerationally? Teachers, undergraduates, graduate students, ideally, coming together in a world where online education is becoming more and more important. And also, if you haven't engaged in online education, how do you do it after you've given a lecture? You give a lecture to 150 people. What are the best ways to have people have an opportunity to come together, to think about, to talk about what you have just tried to teach them? So if we could take 4 minutes, now not just to your person to your right or to your left, but as we did it this morning in little discussions, little clusters, if you could find 2 or 3 people around you, turn around, tap the person in front of you on the shoulder, and form a few clusters to answer this question: how can we preserve and even enhance the community of learners?
Taking notes.
I took notes on you all, too.
You're fine. The
Yeah.
Okay, so the usual drill is for you to ask the first question and then to open it up to the audience. Wait till you tell the person to wait till they get a microphone and to introduce themselves if they can before they speak. And if you want to just invite them to try to be brief with their questions. They usually aren't, but you can try to invite them. Okay?
Should I cut him off?
You're the journalist.
And Bob?
Until Nan finishes. She's going to
Right,
come
no,
back for a minute.
how long does that go on for? The questions
So
answers.
you're going to see the minutes that you'll have left.
Oh.
Essentially, it is until 3:30.
Okay.
But it'll show up right there as you're coming down. As you get toward the end, I'll kind of stand up and start to signal you that we're needing to end, and I'll thank everybody.
Perfect. You're on. I just get to ask a question or two. It's all you guys.
Okay, if you could bring your conversations to a close. If you could bring your conversations to a close, you're better at this than I am, Bob. Bob. Oh, good. Good. So we finally get to hear the harmonica. We have only a few seconds left, and so I won't have a chance to ask for reports. I never intended to. Each group, tell us what you said. I guess I just wanted to ask one question, though, not surprisingly. I'll be interested to know, in which of your little discussion groups did you spend more time, most time, about thinking about novel ways of connecting people virtually, In which groups did you spend almost all your time thinking about real face-to-face interaction? And in which groups did you talk about both pretty evenly? So how many people spent most of their time trying to be innovative and thinking about virtual community of scholars? A few, okay. How many people spent most of their time thinking about real ones? A few more, maybe about half. The rest of you then talked, raise your hands, about both? Yes. I'm not surprised by those balances, and it's interesting in itself. So one question to leave you with in my last 20 seconds. This is not for discussion now, but this is for you to think about, since so much of our work today has been excitingly about innovation. I would like you occasionally, as you continue on with your own leading role in innovation at Harvard and elsewhere, to occasionally step back and say, so what is it most important to preserve? What do I think we should make sure we do not lose? And I use the word we deliberately. It's not as though they should really be sure we preserve this. It is we. We need to work together to think about what is most important for us to sustain at the time when we're all rightly very excited about innovation, and make sure that we do both. Thank you.